And now, from the BBC in London, it's Sarah and Company with Sarah Ward.
Hello again. And as we enter 1984, I think it's a good moment to explore the way one particular form of music is crossing all kinds of boundaries. Today my guest is Charles Alexander, the president of the International Jazz Federation. And in his work he keeps a close eye on jazz in Europe. For instance, last October, Charles, you were at a big jazz festival in Warsaw, Poland. And I think it had come as a surprise to a lot of people to discover that there's a flourishing jazz scene in Eastern Europe.
Yes, it does come as a surprise to many people. But in fact, there has been a jazz scene in many countries in Eastern Europe for years and years and years.
Has it been underground for some time?
At certain times it was difficult for musicians to play freely. But in Poland now, jazz is really quite a major musical force. And in fact, this festival I was at was the 25th anniversary of the Jazz Jamboree, which is the festival that takes place every year in Warsaw, in October.
And jazz musicians from all over the world were taking part in it?
Indeed they were. They had Miles Davis there. And Miles Davis not only played there, he played 3 encores, which I couldn't believe. So
jazz is definitely alive and well in Eastern Europe. Now, where has the major influence come from then in those countries? Have people been listening to, let's say, American jazz musicians? What's been happening?
Well, very much listening to American jazz musicians, and that's really down to one man, actually, who's Willis Conover, who has been broadcasting since, I think, about 1944 on Voice of America to Eastern Europe. So generations now of jazz fans have learnt about Charlie Mingus, Charlie Parker, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, thanks to Willis Conover. But not only has he done that, he's also played the jazz music that has been coming out of Eastern Europe, and that's been a great stimulus and encouragement to
great sort of two-way movement.
Very much so.
Well, Charles, today you've brought with you some records of some of the most interesting music coming out of some of the countries in Eastern Europe, and perhaps we could start with Poland, because that has a very flourishing jazz scene, doesn't it?
Yes, indeed it does, yes. I would say there are hundreds and hundreds of jazz musicians in Poland, and of a very high standard as well. There's a very strong Polish jazz society with branches in the major cities. They organise tours, they have clubs. There's 2 jazz clubs in Warsaw which operate regularly. One is called the Aquarium, and the other is a student club. And they have concerts almost every night and very good artists. There's a big band, which is of a high standard as well. And, you know, their musicians work in every idiom of jazz, from Dixieland right through to the sort of jazz funk and into avant-garde as well.
Who do you think is perhaps the most influential musician making music, making jazz in Poland now?
Well, I think really the leading musician in Poland is without doubt Zbigniew Namysłowski, who plays alto saxophone and was actually in Great Britain at Ronnie Scott's Club in 1965. And he made a record called Lola, which was issued on Decca then, and that made a profound impression on people here. And the reason for that was because, in a sense, it was the first record of European jazz that had a definite European stamp. There were Polish folk melodies intertwined with jazz themes, and he used time signatures like 13/4, 7/4, which were very unfamiliar in jazz at that time.
Perhaps, Charles, we could hear what he sounds like now on one of the records that you brought in with you today.
Yes, this one is Kujaviak Goes Funky.
Wonderful title.
Yes.
Little Lamb Lost. I think I'm going to leave you to do the pronouncing part of this programme, Charles, because it's a complicated name, but he's one of the most important musicians in Poland.
That was Zbigniew Namysłowski.
What about the younger bands, Charles, in Poland? I mean, are they making impressive sort of jazz steps forward as well?
Yes, they are. I think jazz goes through cycles, and there have been times when Polish jazz has had very much its own character. I think in the last few years it's been looking outside of Poland for its influences. However, I think some of these have been consolidated in a band called String Connection, which features a very, very good violinist called Krzesimir Déczi and a bass guitar player who's a true virtuoso called Krzysztof Szyranski. And he plays very, very good bass and sort of a bit like Jaco Pastorius, but he's not just a copy. He's a very original player.
To sum up, what do you think the sound is of String Connection? Does it again have this sort of mark of European jazz, or is it a bit more sort of leaning towards the American?
It has both. It's got the fusion influences, the very tight rhythm section, careful, ordered writing, but it also has the harmonic approach and a lot of the wit and humour that comes out of Poland and that part of Eastern Europe.
So let's listen now to String Connection, an album called Workaholic and a track called Cantabille in B minor. And that's the sound of String Connection there from Poland. Moving on to Hungary now, another country that you yourself have visited, Charles. What's the scene like there? Is it very different to the one that you've been describing in Poland? I mean, for instance, are there lots of clubs and a flourishing sort of ground-level jazz scene there?
I think it's a different situation. Hungary is a much smaller country. There is quite a healthy jazz scene and some very, very good jazz musicians. It's worth remembering that the guitar player Gábor Szabó left Hungary to go to America and made a big name for himself over in the States in the 1960s and 70s. And he was typical of the kind of musicians from Hungary as well. Again, possibly there's more emphasis on formal training in Hungary, and one of the reasons for that is the existence of a jazz department since 1965 in the Béla Bartók Conservatory, and that is headed by János Gonda, who not only is a very fine educator, but is also a brilliant musician and composer. And I would like to play one of his records, which is by his Sextet, and the record is called Shaman Song, and it's a sort of jazz interpretation of a Siberian chant. I think it's something quite special.
mindenségemből egyedül maradtam. Erőink elhagytak, nagy nemzetségemből egyedül maradtam, nagy nemzetségemből egyedül maradtam, erőink elhagytak, egyedül maradtam.
So that's Shaman's song there from the Janus Gonda Sextet, based in Hungary, of course. Now, this business of having a special department in the conservatory, as you've described, in Hungary, is this unique to Hungary, or are there other sort of situations like that in Eastern Europe?
I don't think it's unique to Hungary, but I think the Béla Bartók Conservatory is probably the leader. There is generally throughout Europe, both East and West, a growing consciousness about jazz in education, and educators who perhaps don't have prior interest in jazz are beginning to recognize the value of an approach in improvisation. And so there are quite a number of jazz schools or departments, but they vary in size and they vary, I think, also, to be fair, they vary in quality as well.
We must also just refer to Janus Gonda again, because like you, he's part of the International Jazz Federation. And Charles, what exactly do you do? What do you get up to? Is it a way of sort of bringing jazz musicians throughout Europe together? What happens?
Well, János Gonda is one of the founder members of the International Jazz Federation, and he is a vice president with special responsibility for education. The Federation is a voluntary organisation. We're affiliated to UNESCO through its International Music Council, and our aim really is just to improve the opportunities for people to play and to listen to jazz music. We're all involved in jazz music professionally in one way or another, either as performing musicians or as broadcasters or as record producers or festival organisers or jazz society administrators. It's that sort of thing. And, for example, we run a course in Germany every 2 years for music teachers who wish to get experience in jazz so they can go back into their classrooms and teach people the basis of improvisation. We also have a directory of jazz festivals, so we have run an information service as well, and there is a likelihood that that will be expanding into quite a major service soon. We run a competition in Europe for young jazz musicians. We started that in 1982, and this year, the second year, 1983, we had 150 entries from East and West Europe. So it shows the level of interest in jazz. So we're a kind of support organisation for activities that are happening at a national level in each country.
And Charles, through the work of the International Jazz Federation, there's something very exciting happening in Hungary coming up quite soon, really, in April, isn't there?
Yes, well, the International Jazz Federation is one of a number of organisations who are jointly involved in an improvisation symposium. And the idea is to look at improvisation from a number of angles. Look at improvisation as it's used in contemporary European music, in jazz music, and in various traditional musics, and also in classical music, you know, from the 17th century. And the initiative has really come from Hungary here, but I think it's an illustration of the strength and interest in developing music that exists in Hungary.
Well, we'll leave Hungary behind us just for a moment and turn to Yugoslavia now. And perhaps you could tell us, Charles, what's happening there? Again, is it a slightly different scene?
Yes, I think it is. My impression of Yugoslavian jazz is probably a little bit superficial, but it seems to me that perhaps it looks more closely to Western jazz than perhaps some of the other European countries.
What about the musicians you've heard in Yugoslavia who you feel are doing interesting things?
Well, I think there are many. The Bosko Petrovic is a beautiful vibes player, and he's been on the Yugoslav jazz scene for many, many years. Then there's a young band called the Gut-Marković Sextet, and they're kind of a modern, lively bebop band. Very, very good soloists, clever, bright compositions. And they're featured on a record that the International Jazz Federation has put together, which is a sort of showcase of young groups from various European countries. They've got a track called Gutology.
Gutology there from the Gut-Marković Sextet, and they're of course based in Yugoslavia. What about Czechoslovakia? What's happening there?
Well, again, Czechoslovakia has had a jazz scene that goes back many, many years. The English guitar player John McLaughlin, with his Mahavishnu Orchestra in the early 70s, had as his keyboard player Jan Hammer Jr., because Jan Hammer Jr. was a Czechoslovak keyboard player who went across to the United States and decided to stay and make his career there. But his father was a leading jazz musician in Czechoslovakia. So there are several generations of jazz interest in Czechoslovakia.
Well, is it changing, the sound that's coming out of Czechoslovakia now?
There's a very strong music scene in Czechoslovakia, not only in jazz as well, and I think in contemporary rock there's been a lot of very, very lively bands. The two are in a sense quite close, I think. There's a guitar player, for example, called Rudolf Dašek, and he, I think, is a little bit similar, perhaps in style, to the Hungarian guitar player Gabor Szabo, and he plays really like no American guitar player plays. He's got a very kind of European approach to it. Very intense player, and I'd like to feature a track from an album that he made, and this album is a series of duets with various musicians. This one is a duet with a trumpet player called Laco Déczi, and the track is called Návrat.
That's Návrat, Rudolf Dašek. When you talk about this very European sort of sound that a lot of musicians have now, this European sort of playing, can you describe what you actually mean by that, Charles?
There's often a different rhythmic feel. And I mentioned an obvious example, which is the different time signatures and their natural use of that. For musicians from the West, sometimes time signatures like 7/4, 5/4, 13/4 are really hard to get, and they sound quite stilted when they do them. For musicians who come from a folk tradition where they have dances in 13/4 and think nothing of them, those rhythms are a lot more natural. There's also a harmonic background, which is perhaps less rooted in kind of, I was going to say Tin Pan Alley harmony, which is where a lot of jazz harmony dances stem from. For example, the musicians who've listened and been brought up in a tradition where Bartók's music abounds are bound to have a different type of harmonic ear. And the further east you go, in a sense, if you go into the Balkans, you get, again, music where quarter tones become more acceptable than they are in the West. And I'm not suggesting that many Eastern European musicians use quarter tones, but their ear is perhaps more open to that kind of approach.
So altogether, the sounds we're hearing from Europe and the developments there are truly exciting.
I think they're very exciting, in fact. I have to say that jazz music in Europe is under-recognised. We still, certainly in this country, tend to be dominated by American jazz. One of the things I'd like to see happen is an increasing awareness of what's happening in Europe, because I think there are very, very exciting movements.
Well, Charles Alexander, thank you very much indeed for joining me today on Sarah and Company. And let's listen to some more jazz from Eastern Europe as we say goodbye. This is the Prague Big Band. Tell us a bit about them.
Well, this is led by a pianist called Milan Svoboda, very energetic musicians, and they've travelled outside Czechoslovakia. They were in West Germany at the Leverkusen Jazz Festival, and I think they're very representative of the kind of spirit and strength that comes out of Eastern Europe.
And my thanks again to Charles Alexander for his informed look at the jazz scene in Eastern Europe, a hopeful way to welcome 1984. I'll be back next week with more goodies, so till then, Sarah Ward in London saying bye-bye and leaving you with the Prague Big Band.